So yeah, thanks to the Royal Australian Historical Society and its president, Christine Yates, for inviting me to give the talk. Thanks to the State Library of New South Wales for awarding me a David Scott Mitchell Fellowship some years ago now, under which the research that underpins this lecture was done. Thanks to numerous others as well, too many to mention, but I will mention Christine Mitchell, Tom Griffiths, Kathy Perkins, Mark McKenna, and Richard White. So to the book that I'm here to talk about, and where better to begin than the title, Idling in Green Places. Some readers said they liked it, some said they didn't, mainly because the subject of the biography, Alec Chisholm, was not an idle man. In fact, he led an extraordinarily busy life with activities and attainments spanning a vast range of interests. But the words of my title are Alec's own, taken from his entry in the 1933 edition of Who's Who in Australia. In Who's Who, there's a space for favourite recreations, and most contributors put down something bland and predictable like golf or fishing or growing roses. But Alec was more imaginative. He gave his recreation as idling in green places, by which he meant communing with nature, because Alec was first and foremost a naturalist. On the front cover photo, there's a clear giveaway about his favourite way of idling in green places, bird watching, advertised by the binoculars held at the ready. The photo is of Alec bird watching in Lavington National Park in southern Queensland, the haunt of two of his favourite birds, the Albert's lyrebird and the Rufous scrubbird. At this point, I should acknowledge or admit that I'm a bird watcher too, and that no doubt had some role in shaping my biography of Alec. There's another giveaway in the photo, and that's the pipe stuck in his mouth. You won't find many birders today pursuing their pastime while puffing on a pipe, but in Alec's day, it was nothing remarkable. Which points to the fact that Alec is a figure from a different age, an Australia that's recognisably similar to ours today, but as we look closer, the image falls in and out of focus, as all sorts of things, big and small, seem alternately familiar and weirdly unfamiliar. What I wanted to do in my biography of Alec was to properly position him in that familiar yet unfamiliar world of the past, that foreign country where they do things differently, in L.P. Hartley's memorable phrase. But as in the real foreign countries to which we fly on jet planes, or used to before COVID-19 grounded them and us, the actions of foreigners from the past are not completely incomprehensible. They merely require some imaginative effort to enter. So Idling in Green Places is a biography, the story of an individual life, but I hope it also illuminates the social and cultural landscape in which that life was led. Over Alec's lifetime, that landscape changed dramatically. Born in 1890, before motor cars were known on this continent, he lived to see on TV the Apollo moon landings. When he was born, the Federation of the Australian Colonies was still a dream. Before he died in 1977, he witnessed one of the most convulsive events of that federation, the dismissal of the Whitlam government. Along the way, he witnessed at first hand some of the tumult of world politics, most notably in hearing the rantings of Adolf Hitler at a Berlin rally he attended while visiting Germany in 1938. Alec didn't go to Germany to hear Hitler rant. He went to participate in the learned civilities of an ornithological congress. But events caught up with him, to the extent that he had to hastily flee Germany as the Czechoslovak crisis deepened and the world teetered on the edge of war. Encountering the unforeseen is one of the wonderful things about melding history with biography. There's always an element of serendipity in historical research, but biography seems to dial it up a few notches, as our characters do all sorts of unexpected things that put them in historically interesting situations. But most of Alec's life was more mundane than his dalliance with danger in Nazi Germany. He was born in the Victorian country town of Maryborough, attended school only to the age of 12, which was not so remarkable then, and drifted between several dead-end jobs before, in 1911, at the age of 21, beginning a career as a journalist. From there, he went on to establish himself as a nature writer, becoming one of Australia's most popular practitioners of that genre in the middle third of the 20th century. So it's to his career as a nature writer and conservationist that I'll now turn. Alec's first book, Mateship with Birds, was published in 1922. He went on to publish more than 20 books over the next 50 years, but none had a title as fresh and entrancing as that one. And the contents matched the title. In lavish prose, profuse with imagery, and studded with stanzas of quoted verse, he urged his readers to open their hearts to their avian compatriots and embrace them as friends and fellow Australians. Sometimes the didacticism was direct, as where he asked Australians to accept the wing of friendship the birds held out to them, for if they did, the story of St. Francis of Assisi would pale by comparison with our experiences of every day. Usually, the proselytizing was less explicit, but throughout the book, Alec preached the gospel of conservation. It was conservation in an emotive key. Bird conservation was a cause that first impelled Alec into public notice. In 1908, aged 18, he got involved in the campaign to stop the slaughter of egrets for their plumes, then used to adorn ladies' millinery. Stopping the plume trade was one of the big conservation battles of the day, fought through emotive appeals to public sensitivities. One of its most powerful interventions was a series of photographs published by the ornithologist Arthur Mattingly of egret chicks slowly starving to death while their parents' corpses rotted beside them on their nests. Alec's youthful contribution to the campaign against the plume trade was far less influential, but he never forgot the lesson that the conservationist cause depended on emotion as well as reason. In 1908, he also published his first articles in the Australian Ornithologists' Union journal, the Emu. They were pleas for bird conservation, one focusing on the silver eye, the other on the grey-crowned babbler. And these were couched in more pragmatic terms, arguing the bird's usefulness as destroyers of insect pests. A utilitarian strand was prominent in the conservationism of the day, running alongside emotive appeals for people to treasure the wonders of nature. Alec was a master at running the two in tandem, and the emotive vehicle almost always ran first when he publicised the plight of birds and pleaded for their preservation. While Alec indulged freely in emotive language, there was a homeliness to his advice on how mateship with birds could be cultivated. One way was by giving birds attractive names. Jackie Winter and Willie Wagtail struck the right note, he thought, and it would be a healthy thing, he wrote, if we had more of these familiar names for our birds, bringing as they do a feeling or sense of intimacy. For Alec, euphonious bird names were not superficial trifles, but active promoters of a conservationist ethos. A happy title, he contended, is a great asset to a bird. Indeed, it is doubtful if any bird can fairly sing its way into the hearts of the people under the handicap of a heavy name. This, he acknowledged, was seeing things from the human standpoint, but Alec never resiled from the conviction that the human standpoint was what counted for most in the conservationist cause. That conviction is repudiated by environmentalists today in favour of an ecocentric perspective privileging biodiversity and the integrity of the ecosphere. Yet Alec's humanistic stance did not blind him to the intrinsic worth of living things. He insisted that birds, animals and plants, along with inanimate elements of the landscape, should be preserved for their own sake, not only for the pleasure and convenience of human beings. But people held the upper hand, a power of life and death over other living things, so it was they who had to be persuaded to do the preserving. As Alec knew, nothing is more persuasive than emotion. Alec not only avowed a humanistic standpoint on nature, he blurred the distinction between humans and animals. His nature writings are strewn with anthropomorphism, imbuing birds with human-like characteristics. And this wasn't merely a literary conceit. Alec believed that birds really did have thoughts and feelings like those of humans, that much of their behaviour was driven by joie de vivre, that bowerbirds practiced art for art's sake, and lyrebirds crafted their songs with the conscious pride of an artist. His insistence on these things vexed his scientist friends like Jock Marshall, but as Alec asked, what right have we to presume that man is the only creature on earth that loves to play with sounds and sweet airs? Alec's popular appeal as a nature writer owed much to his skill at combining a scientific documentation of nature with emotive evocations of its wonders. As a reviewer of his 1932 book, Nature Fantasy in Australia Enthused, Alec, in his writings, combines with the exact research of a scientist, the sensibility of a poet, and the spiritual freedom and large temper of a man of letters. Throughout his nature writings, Alec threaded the theme of conservation, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly, but always bearing the message that nature was a source of joy to be embraced and cherished. Yet what was strengths in his younger days became impediments in his later years. By the 1960s and 70s, Alec's overtly literary style of nature writing, along with his anthropomorphizing and humanistic conservation, went out of fashion. Having been one of Australia's most popular nature writers in the second third of the 20th century, by the beginning of its last third, his public profile was fading. Alec knew it was fading, and it distressed him deeply. As public acclaim withered, Alec became increasingly querulous and tetchy. In my biography, I pay due heed to these and other unpleasant facets of his character, his vanity and hankering after public adulation, his tendency to embroider and embellish his own role in the unfolding of events. I'm not writing hagiography, and Alec was no saint. He was nonetheless a significant figure in nudging the nation towards a self-conception tied to nature and in promoting conservation as a mainstream endeavour. One of the biggest challenges in writing his biography was in getting the right balance between honouring his very real achievements and acknowledging his all too human failings. Maybe that's a challenge all biographers face. Alec's main claim to fame was as a naturalist, especially a birder. However, his talents were diverse and he won recognition in several fields despite his lack of formal education. In fact, Alec was a self-educated polymath of a kind that has almost vanished from Australian public life today. As well as a journalist, he was an historian, biographer, and encyclopedist. I'll look at each of those in turn, beginning with his career as a historian. Alec's interest in history was sparked not at school, where he found history lessons tediously irrelevant to his life, but shortly after he began work for the Maryborough and Dunaway Advertiser. That newspaper dated back to the gold rushes of the 1850s, and its office held masses of old issues. When work was quiet, he fossicked among old newspapers, seeking stories about his hometown's heyday. It was an undisciplined introduction to history, but Alec retained something of a bowerbird approach in his later historical studies, sifting through the documentary record to find glittering nuggets of fact. He wrote several historical works as a young man, including a history of ornithology in Queensland, but his big break came when he visited the United Kingdom in 1938. That year was the 100th anniversary of the visit to Australia by the eminent British ornithologist John Gould. So Alec, along with his fellow birders, was on the lookout for new information about Gould. By the simple device of publishing letters seeking that information in the Times and the Daily Telegraph, Alec located a large cache of documents in the possession of Gould's great-grandsons, Doctors Geoffrey and Alan Edelston, in villages in Hampshire and Somerset. The most important of these documents was the diary of Gould's principal collector, John Gilbert, covering his experiences on Ludwig Leichhardt's first expedition from its commencement on the Darling Downs in 1844 through to the day of Gilbert's death on Cape York Peninsula on 28th of June 1845. The diary had been lost for almost 100 years until it was located by Alec in July 1938. On his return to Australia, he gave it to the Mitchell Library, where it remains to this day. Alec wrote several books based on the Gilbert Diary, the most substantial of which was Strange New World, first published in 1941. It recounts Leichhardt's first expedition from the Darling Downs to Port Essington, focusing on the period before Gilbert was fatally speared in 1845. Although it was by far Alec's most popular history book and his most enduring, being issued numerous times, in my view, it's seriously flawed as a work of history. Alec was blatantly partisan, lauding Gilbert to the skies while lambasting Leichhardt as an imposter, and incompetent, and even, in his words, a psychopath. Because Alec so stridently took sides for Leichhardt and against, for Gilbert and against Leichhardt, some scholars have claimed Strange New World to have been motivated by anti-German sentiment. I'm confident that judgment is mistaken. Alec was anti-Leichhardt, not anti-German. When he wrote about the eminent German-Australian botanist Ferdinand von Müller, he had nothing but praise for his attainments and character. When he wrote to and about his German friends, such as ornithologist Erwin Stresemann and Klaus Immelmann, his words betray no trace of antipathy to their nationality. Alec's championing of Gilbert and denigration of Leichhardt derived not from anti-German bias, but from his commitment to a great man of history conception of the discipline. Having discovered the Gilbert Diaries, Alec took it upon himself to resuscitate the reputation of the collector. When he discovered the diaries in 1938, John Gilbert the collector, as against John Gilbert the bushranger, a totally different person, was barely known to the Australian public. Alec was determined that Gilbert would no longer languish in Leichhardt's shadow, but would take his proper place in the sunshine of public acclaim. There was room for only one great man on the expedition's pedestal, so Alec took it upon himself to demolish Leichhardt and applaud Gilbert. The outstanding feature of Strange New World is its brash opinionatedness. That is what breathes life or fire into the text. By contrast, Alec's other historical writings are mostly dry recitations of fact. His 1950 book, for example, Scots Were He, recounts the contributions Scots have made to Australian society and culture. It's competently researched and written, but lacks either the engaging charm of his nature writings or the derogatory dogmatism of Strange New World. Scots Were He points to another facet of Alec's character, his treasuring of his Scottish heritage. He was of Scottish ancestry on both sides, his mother having arrived in Australia as a Gaelic-speaking girl from the Highlands in 1863, while his paternal forebears had left the ancestral homeland some years earlier. When Alec visited the United Kingdom in 1938, Scotland was high on his agenda. The ancestral seat of Clan Chisholm, Urchlis Castle near Stroy, was high on his itinerary, but he was more moved by the tiny Highland village of Enocdu, from which his mother had emigrated as a little girl. Back in Australia in 1950, he became the founding president of the Clan Chisholm Society of New South Wales. As for many Australians of his generation, Scottishness was a quality he saw as complementing, not compromising, his Australianness. In 1949, Alec became a member of the Royal Australian Historical Society. 5 years later, he was elected to the RAHS Council, a role he maintained until his death in 1977. As in everything he did, Alec applied himself energetically to his RAHS duties, becoming vice president for 2 years from 1956, then 2 years as president in 1959 and 60. In 1961, he was elected a fellow of the RAHS, and in 1972, he was voted unanimously and with acclamation to the position of honorary member. He was then 82 years old and in declining health, but he still strove to meet his responsibilities with the RAHS. A year before becoming a member of the RAHS, Alec began what was to be the biggest single undertaking of his life. In July 1948, he started work as editor-in-chief of a new Australian encyclopedia to be published by Angus and Robertson. At first, he and the publishers envisaged simply a revision and update of the 2-volume Australian encyclopedia that had been published in the 1920s, but it soon dawned on Alec, and more slowly on A&R, that what was needed was not a revision, but a whole new book. The Encyclopedia turned into a massive undertaking, 10 years in the making. Its 10 volumes, comprising over 5 million words, were published in mid-1958. Along the way, Alec, as editor-in-chief, had to coax, cajole, and sometimes coerce entries from contributors who were often tardy in putting pen to paper. In fact, during his editorship, the problem about which he most frequently complained was, in his words, the wasteful process of coping with potential contributors that are either dilatory or slovenly or both. He evidently liked those words. He kept repeating dilatory or slovenly or both over and over again. In his more light-hearted moments, he called the problem contributoritis, but he considered it symptomatic of a serious social malaise, a persistent deferral of responsibility that was corrupting social interaction. Alec was a man of conservative social views who put a high premium on duty and obligation. When the Encyclopedia was eventually published in 1958, it drew accolades both nationally and internationally. Today, in the age of Wikipedia, it may be difficult to imagine the excitement generated by a paper encyclopedia, but the excitement and admiration were profuse. Newspapers around Australia published glowing reviews extolling the Encyclopedia not only as an indispensable reference work, but also as a marker of Australia's cultural maturity. Some newspapers went to the extent of comparing the publication of the Encyclopedia with the great public project then underway, the Snowy Mountains Project. International reviewers commonly praise the Encyclopedia for balancing its focus on Australia with attentiveness to Australia's international context. Both national and international reviewers commended the Encyclopedia for being easily readable at the same time as it was accurate and authoritative. This had been Alec's paramount aim, to make the Encyclopedia both readable and accurate, and he seems to have achieved it. As journalist Massey Stanley explained, in the Australian Encyclopedia, you can see Chisholm, the exact scientist, in the scrupulously cross-checked array of facts, and Chisholm, the journalist, in the emphatic clarity and readability of the text. Its appeal spanned the political spectrum. James Duig, Catholic Archbishop of Brisbane, judged the Encyclopedia a great work that might help bridge the sectarian divide that then bedeviled Australian culture and politics. From a different quarter, the Communist Party's Tribune newspaper praised the Encyclopedia as a tribute to Australia, which leaves the reader with a new admiration for our country. The Tribune was pleased too to see the Encyclopedia's attentiveness to the less admirable aspects of Australia, noting especially its 5-page entry headed Aborigines, Conflict With. That entry's discussion of frontier conflict was a bit sketchy, but its inclusion in the Encyclopedia signalled a growing public willingness to acknowledge the nation's violent foundations. Indeed, the entire 99 pages devoted to Aborigines in the Encyclopedia attest to a growing appreciation of the need to accept Aboriginal people into the Australian nation. They also attest to Alec's readiness to nudge public attitudes a bit further. At over 80,000 words, the section on Aborigines was the biggest in the Encyclopedia. Most of those words were about the ethnography of pre-colonial Aboriginal societies, but there was also a section on the white contact by anthropologist Norman Tyndale, dealing with race relations and contemporary issues such as education, social welfare and civil rights. Even some ethnographic entries signal growing respect. For example, the largest entry on Aboriginal beliefs is one headed Religion by Professor A.P. Elkin of the University of Sydney. Elkin had long insisted that Aboriginal spiritual beliefs must be dignified by the name religion and not belittled, as they usually were, as mere superstition. Alec was persuaded, and Aboriginal beliefs were discussed under the respectful label religion. In June 1958, just after the Encyclopedia was published, and largely in consequence of its publication, Alec was appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, that is an OBE. It was the most prestigious award he had yet received or ever would. Congratulations poured in from Prime Minister Robert Menzies, Deputy PM Jack McEwen, poet Mary Gilmore, librarian Harold White, and numerous other notables, as well as some hundreds of Australians of no public eminence. Alec adored the accolades. One of his weaknesses was a craving for public adulation, a craving that became more intense as he aged. But in 1958, the plaudits he won for bringing the Encyclopedia to fruition were well deserved. Turning now to his career as a biographer, Alec seems to have had a special talent for the brief biographical sketch. I don't know how many such biographies he contributed to the 1958 Encyclopedia, but there were certainly many. He also contributed 18 entries to the ADB, one of them's on the screen there, and numerous other short biographies to various magazines and journals. In 1944, Alec published a biography of Elizabeth Gould, by which he hoped to bring her out from under the shadow of her famous husband, John. He tried to demonstrate Elizabeth's artistic talents and to show her as a woman of exceptional courage and determination. But his efforts faltered. The story of Elizabeth Gould is not a great biography, nor are his other biographical works on women, such as his 1948 biographical sketch of the feminist Rose Scott. Alec genuinely wanted to give women the recognition they deserved, but his attempts to do so seem to have stumbled on male presumptions common among men of his generation. More successful was his biography of Ferdinand von Mueller. Alec extolled von Mueller for his veneration of Australia's forests and warnings against clearing them. But it wasn't only for his conservationist leanings that he lauded the botanist. In several passages, he remarked on von Mueller's vanity and oversized ego, but related it empathetically, not as a blemish of character, but as an interesting facet of a man of high intellect and achievement. They were traits that Alec could readily identify with because he shared them. Alec's major biography was of the poet C.J. Dennis, first published in 1946 as The Making of a Sentimental Bloke. It was reissued many times thereafter. It's a chatty and digressive biography bearing clear signs that Alec and Dennis were personal friends. It got good reviews, attracted lots of readers, but not everyone was impressed. The artist Norman Lindsay, for example, complained that the biography skated over unsalient content in Dennis's makeup, and that was his addiction to booze. Downplaying the drinking eviscerated the biography, Lindsay suggested. In fact, Alec had been asked by Dennis's widow to omit all references to his drinking. Alec said that was impossible, but he didn't like to draw too much attention to something he regarded as a personal failing. For others, as for himself, Alec had a strong sense of personal privacy, which is not necessarily a helpful attribute for a biographer. He seems to have had a future biographer and his sense of personal privacy in mind when he organised his papers for dispatch to the Mitchell Library. This was done when aged in his 80s, physically unwell and mentally disorientated after the death of his wife, Olive. He was also by this time in the 1970s an embittered and cantankerous man, aware that his star was fading as a contributor to public debate on the issues he held dear, such as nature conservation, but unable to do anything about it. On 26th of April 1977, only 2.5 months before Alec's death, Mitchell librarian Susan Moreau had a telephone conversation in which he told her that he was culling his papers and destroying letters of too personal a nature. Moreau tried to stop him, but she was unsuccessful. I have no way of knowing how many documents Alec destroyed, but his massive collection of papers at the Mitchell Library, there's over 50 archive boxes stuffed almost to bursting, contained few items of a highly personal nature. Perhaps that's not an unusual hurdle for biographers to face, although it inevitably leaves gaps in the portrayal of personality. Such gaps notwithstanding, I hope my biography gives a fair and balanced account of a man who was once a household name in Australia, but more recently has been at risk of slipping from view. So to conclude, Alec is worth remembering primarily because he helped inspire Australians to see nature anew. As I've shown over the past 40 minutes, and as my biography shows in greater detail, his achievements span many domains. Yet it's for fostering an affinity with nature that is most worthy of remembrance. On that note, I'll close with an observation on his continuing relevance. Alec's world is gone. Our views on nature today are cluttered with fears unknown in his day, such as climate change. Yet there's still something in Alec's writings that speaks to us today. It's the need to connect emotionally and tangibly with nature. To hear that message, we don't need to jettison today's environmental fears, yet fear is not enough. It needs complementing with more positive emotions like love. Alec tried to foster such feelings by inviting us to see into the souls of birds. Perhaps the language of his invitation is too lush for modern tastes, but its purpose still holds. Despite or because of the prominence of environmental alarms in today's world, the need to love and cherish living things remains as pressing as ever, perhaps more pressing than when Alec urged his fellow Australians to become mates with birds. Thank you. I'm sorry if I've gone over time. If so, it's because of my technological incompetence at the beginning.
Oh, thank you, Russell. It was a very lovely talk, very informative. So we're going to flick over to questions now. And no, it wasn't too long, by the way. So we've got one question already, and it's come from Alison Billing. Alison asks, and we're just going to go through these. Can you expand on the reasons why his biographies of women weren't so successful?
I expand on it a little. I expand on it a little in the biography, not in great detail. However, I'm merely suggesting that, like all of us, I guess, Alec is a product of the culture of his times, and although his efforts to give women the recognition that they deserve just don't seem to quite make it. Simply because I'm thinking he's perhaps this is not just a cultural issue of his day, but of all times. He's unable to put himself in women's frame of mind. Perhaps in some ways he was better at imagining himself as a bird than as a female human being.
We have another question now from Mark. Mark asks, what did Alec achieve as president of the RAHS?
What did he achieve as president of the RAHS? Well, in his day, it was a significantly administrative sort of role. When he was president of the RAHS, that was the time that he's not really at the peak of his public notability. I think that comes rather earlier, but it is around the same time as he's awarded an OBE and attains a certain level of public notice. So I think perhaps one of his main achievements as president was to raise the public profile of the RAHS and perhaps of history as well. Although his letters from that time, however, indicate that in the RAHS there was quite a bit of bickering going on at that time. I'm not sure whether that comes as a surprise. It may be more surprising for people to learn that dealing with bickering was nothing new to Alex. The ornithological organisation was absolutely rife with bickering over issues that outsiders would find incomprehensible. But anyway, his correspondence from around the time that he was vice president and president of the RAHS indicates there's quite a bit of conflict going on at the time involving some notable people like Malcolm Ellis, Manning Clark, two men who were renowned for, they got to the stage where they couldn't be in the same room together. And in terms of settling such disputatious behaviour, I doubt that Alec would have been very good, to be honest. He himself was inclined in the same direction.
I've read a bit about Malcolm Ellis, so he sounds like a difficult character.
Yes, yes. Alec clashed with him too over the Encyclopedia quite a few times because Malcolm Ellis was supposed to write certain contributions. He did in fact write some contributions for the Encyclopedia, but yeah, there was a bad falling out with Alec.
All right, so there's a question from Christine, which asks, did Alec Chisholm have any role with the teaching of nature in New South Wales schools? Yes,
in New South Wales less so. His major role in the nature studies classes was when he was still a young man in Victoria. And then after he left Victoria, he moved to Queensland in 1915 until 1922. Very much involved with nature studies classes. In fact, the last slide I showed has a picture. I don't think you can see that now, but it has a picture of one of his nature studies classes in the Victorian bush in 1914. And the slide before that has him teaching a nature studies class, which actually includes adults as well, at Gomerri in southern Queensland in 1921. In New South Wales, he still did some nature studies classes, but by that time, he was doing less. I think the demands of his job as a journalist, it's because it's after he moves to New South Wales at the end of 1922, that's when he really begins to build up a public profile. And from that time on, his hands-on nature studies, education stuff begins to decline.
All right, so we have a question from Richard White. So Richard asks, and you may need to help me with the translation here because it looks like it's a French word that I've never seen before. So he asks, to what extent is natural science now more likely to see some possibility of, for example, bird intelligence? And then I'm not too sure if you can see that, joie de vivre, sorry, apologies. So yes, to what extent is natural science now more likely to see some possibility of that?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, Alec Alec put quite a lot of attention on the notion that birds had thoughts and feelings, that they were in many respects not the same as people, but shared a lot of intellectual and emotional attributes somewhat similar to human beings. A lot of his other nature writers of the day did so too. Scientists back then tended to be dismissive of it. Through to very recently. These days, however, there's quite a strong movement in zoological sciences these days, stressing the fact that birds and some other animals not that they think and feel like people do, but they do have intelligence of a kind that, while it's not the same as human intelligence, is similar in certain respects. In fact, I was only reading just the other day another article in the New Scientist on that, referring particularly to corvids, crows and ravens, and their ability to intellectualize. And they're even beginning to wonder if some birds might not have some form of self-consciousness. Again, it cannot be a self-consciousness as humans do, but possibly an awareness, not only of the world around them, but awareness that they are aware of the world around them. Whereas in Alec's day, these sorts of ideas were prominent among the amateur naturalists, but not among scientists. Today, those ideas of animal, including avian intelligence and emotionality, are gaining new scientific respectability.
Okay, we have another question from Anne Broffrey. Anne asks, in Mateship with Birds, I was struck by his promotion of birding in the local area and a belief that you could or would never know that area completely. What a wonderful idea for today. Did this way of thinking continue through his life, or did it change with age?
Yeah, local birding is something that not only Alec, but all the birders back then did a lot. A lot of their birding was done in the suburbs and just beyond the suburban fringe. After all, time of Mateship with Birds, 1922, cars were a elite thing. And most people didn't possess their own motor vehicles. To go beyond, they would normally, if they went outside their local area, rely on public transport or shared transport of some kind. A great deal of the birding in early 20th century Australia is very, very local. That remains the case right through to the present day. As I said, I'm a birder. A lot of what I do is local. I mean, I also, to a much greater extent than Alec Chisholm ever did, I go on trips up to far north Queensland or whatever as well. But a great deal of it is done locally, and a great deal of the nature studies was about appreciating nature in your own backyard, appreciating what you can experience in and near home was a really big part of what Alec wrote about and what other naturalists of the day wrote about. And he did continue that through to the end of his days. I mean, in that connection, I could note that although he wrote a lot mainly about birds and nature more generally, Alec never visited remote Australia. He never, in Australia, he never went further than the Atherton Tablelands, which he only visited a couple of times. He went to WA once or twice. Never went to Central Australia. Never went to the Northern Territory. None of those places were visited. Most of his nature activities were actually conducted in a zone bounded by just to the north of Brisbane, where I am at the moment, down to Melbourne, along the sort of eastern seaboard.
Okay, we've run through all the questions. So I think we might end it there. Thank you, Russell, for your talk today. It was very enlightening, very interesting. And thank you to our participants who joined us and gave us such great questions. We hope you enjoyed this day lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you, Russell. It's been great.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks for attending, everyone. And yeah, I hope the technological glitch at the beginning, well, it's not a glitch, it's my technological incompetence at the beginning, wasn't too off-putting. Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you.